It was a calm day on the broad expanse of the Indian Ocean. Drifting on the water was a large Muslim transport ship known as the Miri. On board were over 300 men, women, and children. Of the latter, some were merely infants. They were returning from Mecca on Hajj, that is, on pilgrimage, but now their ship was dead in the water. The masts were destroyed, the weapons had been confiscated, and some of the cargo had already been plundered. What's more, the rudder had been literally stripped from the hull. Circling the disabled vessel was not just a fleet, but an armada of Portuguese vessels, all bristling with weaponry. The wealthy merchants on board the Miri had initially surrendered without a fight. They were, after all, used to negotiating their way out of issues like this with the local pirates. However, the overall commander of the Armada was Vasco da Gama, a man who had returned to the Indian Ocean to unleash vengeance, which was now at a fever pitch. The once explorer, now promoted to the rank of admiral, had refused every lucrative offer that came his way and had declined all forms of diplomacy. He passively watched as the women on the stricken vessel held up their children and pleaded for mercy. But in the end, his final solution was to set the ship on fire and let it burn with everyone on board. Tome Lopes, a chronicler and eyewitness of the event, was horrified with what he saw. Nigel Cliff, in his book The Last Crusade, surmises his thoughts well. Quote, Tome Lopes was stunned, shocked by the admiral's refusal to relent, and amazed that he was willing to turn down such wealthy offers. There was no doubt in his mind that the ransom would have been enough to buy the freedom of every Christian prisoner in Morocco. Yet despite his misgivings, there were plenty of zealous Christians among the crews who had no more qualms than their crusader forebears about killing peaceful merchants and pilgrims. The dehumanizing notion that their enemies in faith were somehow not real people was too deeply ingrained. Like holy warriors, before and after, they avoided looking into their victims' eyes and got on with their godly business. End quote. With a nod from Vasco da Gama, Portuguese engineers came on board the Miri. They systematically locked all the people of the ship in the holds, then set incendiary charges and quickly exited the scene. The people on board the Miri were now left to watch with terror as the flames that surrounded them began to rise. King Manuel I of Portugal was convinced that a new approach was needed if the great markets of spice far to the east were to be his. In a prior voyage, Pedro Alvarez Cabral had been dispatched to India, but he had suffered tremendous losses, and in the eyes of the king, his mission had failed. The sovereign had decided that diplomacy was over, aggression was now needed, and thus a new armada had been created. In all, there were now 20 ships, many of which were larger and more powerful than anything that the Portuguese had fielded. On board were experienced men who knew how to not only sail, but more importantly, how to wage war. King Manuel wanted the commander of this vast new armada to be someone who was willing to show Portugal's ferocity to the world. The commander he appointed was a veteran who had been nursing a grudge for a long time. A man whose anger had reached a boiling point. He was someone who would be willing to dish out some major payback. Now, neighboring Castile at this point had made Christopher Columbus their admiral of the ocean sea. Not wanting to be outdone, Manuel granted his new commander, Vasco da Gama, the title Admiral of India. The title, by the way, was a political jab. Gama, after all, had made it to India, whereas Columbus had not. The 20 ships of what would be known as the Fourth Portuguese Armada was divided into 3 squadrons. Vasco da Gama would command the first squadron, which consisted of 10 ships from his flagship, the São Geronimo, which was a large carrack. Vasco's maternal uncle, Vicente Sodré, now a vice-admiral, would lead the second squadron, which was made up of 5 ships. This second squadron, by the way, also had Brás Sodré, another uncle, Álvaro de Atied, who was a son-in-law, and Gaspar da Gama, who was a very unlikely godson. The third and final squadron, which was still under construction, consisted of 5 more vessels and would be under the stern eye of Estevão da Gama, Vasco's first cousin. Estevão's flagship, by the way, the mighty Flor de la Mar, was destined to become one of the most famous ships in Portuguese history. For all to see, this was going to be more than just an affair for king and country. For Vasco, this was a family business, and his goal was to give the Samudri Raja of Calicut a deal he couldn't refuse. Now, it needs to be mentioned that not all the chroniclers on this voyage give the same story. There is some degree of ambiguity to what actually happened. What is known for certain is that the first contingent of 15 ships, consisting of Vasco da Gama and his uncle Vicente Sodré's squadrons, left Lisbon on February 10, 1502. Estevão da Gama and his 5 ships left 2 months later after construction had been completed on April 1st. The 2 fleets would not rendezvous again until they both reached the Indian Ocean. As before, the main fleet made its way to the Cape Verde Islands. By some accounts, landfall was also made in late February at the Bay of Dakar. From here, they would turn to the southwest, and on March 6th, they began the counterclockwise curving South Atlantic run. The men would suffer from intense heat near the equator, and by mid-April, the North Star was lost below the horizon. The Southern Cross, now a familiar celestial landmark, was once again seen. As they made their way, the weather became colder as they approached the dangerous high-pressure zone of the South Atlantic. It was here in late April and throughout May that the main fleet encountered a host of storms which scattered the 15 ships. Estevão da Gama, coming in 2 months later, would also be hit by a massive storm near the tip of Africa. Miraculously, all 20 ships would survive rounding the Cape of Good Hope and would make it to the Indian Ocean. Once Vasco da Gama and his 15 ships arrived and regrouped off the eastern coast of Africa at a predetermined rally point, the decision was made to move on to Sofala. Sofala was believed to be the biblical port of Ophir, a wealthy city renowned as the location of King Solomon's mines, and perhaps even the capital city for the Queen of Sheba. The city sat on an island at the delta of the Buzi River where the gold trade of eastern Africa funneled its way down. The Armada would arrive on June 10th. Vasco, who had been informed of the significance of the city, immediately surveyed the land for an ideal spot for a fortress. He then sent his men in to begin trading. Over the next 2 weeks, the Portuguese would haul in a massive amount of gold in exchange for simple glass beads, woolen apparel, and other minor goods. Having his ships put their cannons on display seemed to have significantly swayed the exchange rate. The Armada sailed on to Mozambique, a place that Vasco had shelled during his last visit. Now, with nearly 4 times the ships and perhaps 10 times the firepower, the Sultan was all about cooperation. More gold was brought on board before Vasco sailed on. On July 12th, he arrived at Kilwa. The city may have hit its golden age more than a century before, but it was still rich and wealthy from both the gold and ivory trade. However, the Sultan had given the prior Portuguese commander, Pedro Cabral, a cold reception and had gone so far as to deny Vasco an audience, claiming that he was sick. The Portuguese admiral didn't buy it and had no patience for diplomacy. He sailed right into the harbor at full speed. Along the way, he ordered a fleet-wide cannonade to announce his presence, before pulling up right in front of the Sultan's waterside palace and targeting it with everything he had. The chronicler Gaspar Correia recounted his response, quote, "I am the slave of the king, my sovereign. All the men whom you see here and who are in that fleet will do that which I command. And know for certain that if I choose in one single hour, your city will be reduced to embers. And if I choose to kill your people, they will all be burned in that fire." End quote. The Sultan suddenly emerged, and Vasco simply gave him a to-do list. Gama demanded that the Portuguese would now have the rights to trade in gold, ivory, and spice under very favorable conditions. Kilwa would henceforth be a vassal and was now required to pay the King of Portugal a hefty annual tribute for protection. And the Sultan was now required to fly the Portuguese flag from the tallest tower of his palace. With Kilwa brought down a notch, the Armada made its way and arrived at friendly Malindi on July 27th. With a line of ships stretching to the horizon, Malindi was now friendlier. 2 days later, on July 29th, with the winds of the monsoon building to crescendo, Vasco da Gama turned his ships to the east and plunged into the Indian Ocean. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors recounts his voyage, quote, "The crossing of the Indian Ocean was comparatively uneventful. By August 20th, 1502, the whole fleet was at the Anjdiva Islands. Along the way, they raided the ports of Anovar and Batkal without any apparent justification. Gama bluntly declared to their cowering Raja, in the words of the chronicler Correia, 'This is the fleet of the King of Portugal, my sovereign, who is the lord of the sea, the world, and also of you.' From here, the Armada moved further south, and by early September, it was at Mount Delhi, a prominent headland backed by sheltering lagoons north of Cannanore. This was the first and last port of call for merchant ships trading along the Malabar coast. The crest of Mount Delhi, 900 feet above sea level, provided a wide lookout point from which to plan a maritime ambush. On September 29, 1502, that chance came. A large dhow was sighted coming from the north. Gama immediately put out to sea with a detachment of ships. His cannons were primed." End quote. The ship was the Miri, a large dhow loaded with pilgrims returning from Mecca. Vasco's fleet quickly surrounded it, and the Miri immediately surrendered. The local merchants were confident that they could negotiate, that is, bribe, their way out of the situation. This was, after all, a common practice on the Indian Ocean, where bribing the local pirates was just business as usual. Money would exchange hands, often there'd be a handshake, and people would be on their way. Thus, the merchants on the Miri made one offer after another, each bid increasing in value. But negotiation gave way to desperation, as Gama accepted none of it. Instead, the admiral demanded everything on the ship be handed over. Tomé Lopes, one of Vasco's men who watched and recorded the event, stated that the merchants gave what they wanted without torture. Apparently, it wasn't enough. Gama was angry. In his first voyage, he had come as an explorer. Now he came as a crusader. In his eyes, he was engaged in a holy war. The ship was stripped of its rudder and its tackle, and by some accounts, its masts were disabled. Then it was towed out far into the ocean. The people on board began to beg for their lives, and it became clear what would happen next. The Portuguese boarded the ship and rigged it to burn with everyone on board. The fires were lit, and the engineers returned to their longboats. Roger Crowley explained what happened next. Quote, "Now understanding the seriousness of their plight, those aboard the Miri responded with spirit. They somehow extinguished the fires and sought out whatever missiles, arms, and stones they could find. They decided to go down fighting. When the longboats returned to reignite the fires, they were met with a hail of missiles hurled by both men and women. They were forced to back off. They attempted to pummel the disabled ship with their gunfire, but the longboats carried cannons too light to inflict serious damage. Even from a distance, they could see the women pleading for their lives, holding out jewelry and precious objects, begging the admiral for mercy. Some even took their little children and held them out. We understood that what they asked for was simply pity," wrote Tomé Lopes, whose account became increasingly more distraught. Gama watched all of this impassively, hidden from sight behind a spy hole. He made no response. On the ship, the passengers started to construct barricades out of mattresses, hurdles, anything they could find. They were determined that they would sell their lives at the highest price. For 5 days, the disabled Miri floated on the hot sea. The ship on which Lopes sailed followed it closely. On the 5th day, they were ordered to finish it off. "We could see everything," wrote Tomé Lopes. "It was Monday, October 3rd, a date I will remember as long as I live." End quote. It was at this point that a single Portuguese ship came alongside the Miri and grappled it. Suddenly, the Muslims sprung into action. They took the ropes and pulled the Portuguese vessel closer. As the Miri was a taller ship, those on board rained down a hail of stones, rocks, whatever they could find. The Portuguese sailors were staggered by the attack. Soon after, the Muslims jumped down and began to board the Portuguese vessel. Nigel Cliff in The Last Crusade described the ferocity of the attack. Quote, "The battle showed no signs of letting up. The Muslims fought with such vehemence that it was marvelous to see, and even though we wounded and killed many, it seemed as if no one was dying and no one felt their wounds. They tore arrows from their skin, flung them back at the attackers, and threw themselves back in the action without a second's pause. They then threw themselves at the stern castle with the superhuman force of men who knew that they were wronged. The victims were now the avengers." End quote. During this entire time, the wind had died down. The rest of the armada could not move in to help. But then, one of the Portuguese ships managed to find a breeze and sailed in. It came in alongside the Miri, feigning an attempt to board it. The Muslim attackers, now seeing this new threat, withdrew to their ship to defend it to the last. It would prove to be a mistake. Lopes' vessel was able to cut the grapple lines and withdrew. With the wind picking up, the rest of the armada sailed in. The fate of the Miri was now sealed. Tome Lopes would lament, "After all those battles, the admiral ordered the ship burned with all the men and women who were on it. This was to be done very cruelly and without the slightest bit of pity." Screams rent the air. Some of the Muslims leapt into the water with hatchets in their hands and swam to the nearest boats, but they were harpooned in the water as they tried to hack at the bottoms of our ships. Almost all the rest, nearly 300 men and women, either burned or were drowned. It was said that before the Miri went down, 20 children were rescued and baptized. Gama would later recount that he had saved their souls. However, all along the Malabar coast, what happened to the Miri would never be forgiven or forgotten. Centuries later, it is still remembered. As the Spanish proverb goes, "La sombra de grandes pecados es muy alargada," meaning the shadow of great sins is very long. Vasco da Gama, Admiral of India, Portuguese crusader, had finally made the entrance that he wanted. But in the grand scheme of things, he was only getting warmed up. The Armada now made its way to the city of Cannanore and took up position in its harbor on October 18th. This was a friendly port that already had a small Portuguese presence. The Colattiri, the Raja of Cannanore, greeted Vasco with his royal entourage. He was flanked by over 400 of his elite Nayar warriors. The admiral refused to set foot on land as he vowed not to touch Indian soil until he had dealt properly with Calicut. Here, royal gifts were exchanged and a new formal treaty was established, but it was not a smooth process. Vasco was easily angered with any deviation from his demands, which included favorable prices on spice, the establishment of a Portuguese factory in the city, and the initiation of the cartaz system. The latter was a system of licensing. From that period onwards, all ships conducting trade had to have proper paperwork or else be subject to attack. That is, Portuguese attack. With favorable negotiations completed, it was now time to move on to Calicut. The admiral and his ships arrived before the great city on October 29th. The Samudri Raja, also known as the Zamorin, by now had heard of this massive incoming fleet and no doubt of the incident with the Miri. Days before, the ruler of Calicut had composed a diplomatic letter to Vasco da Gama. Crowley elaborates, quote, "The Samudri Raja wrote a letter to Gama while he was still in Cannanore in an attempt to establish peace. He wished the Christians nothing but friendship. However, he had written a rather different letter to his rebellious vassal, the Raja of Cochin. In it, he stressed the need for cooperation and gave a crystal clear analysis of their joint situation. There remained only one sure solution. If they did not adopt it, they would all be lost and conquered. He proposed that the whole of the Malabar coast should shut their ports and offer no more spice to the Europeans. Unfortunately, the king of Cochin remained defiant, and it was these cracks in the local politics that would ultimately doom them all. He replied that he was at peace with the Portuguese and had no intention of acting otherwise. Furthermore, he showed the letter to the Portuguese that were living in his city, who passed it on to Gama. The admiral was thus in receipt of both letters as he sailed into Calicut. End quote. As the Armada took up position in the harbor, a Brahmin, that is, a man of the highest caste, approached dressed as a Franciscan friar. He'd been sent by the Samudri Raja to begin talks, but the admiral's response was fierce. Vasco demanded that the Portuguese were to be unhindered in trade, that all spices would have to have an advantageous price, and that all Muslims needed to be expelled immediately. The next day, the Samudri acquiesced to all of Vasco's demands, except for the expulsion of the Muslims. The king of Calicut explained that they were a vital part of commerce for his city, which he emphasized was still an open port. What's more, the Muslims had been there for generations. Simply getting rid of them was not something that he was capable of doing. This response angered the admiral. He immediately captured about 40 fishermen who were coming into the harbor and held them as hostages. The Zamorin, in turn, was not pleased with this action, and tensions grew. On the night of October 31st, Vasco sent a strongly worded response, saying that if all of his demands were not met, at high noon the next day, his ships would fire on the city. That night, the Portuguese scouted the harbor looking for the best firing positions, while the warriors of Calicut began digging trenches, reinforcing them with wooden barricades, and positioning their own cannon to fire back. Nigel Cliff in The Last Crusade explained what followed the next day, quote, "Noon on November 1st, the appointed day, passed with no reply. The admiral made his move. On his command, boats went around the fleet distributing the Muslim captives. 1 hour after midday, the prisoners' necks were placed in nooses and the ends of the ropes were thrown over the yards. The struggling men were hoisted to the top and were hung in full sight of the city, 34 bodies quivering to a standstill. On the shore, the swelling crowd watched in horror. Then the rest of the ships opened fire and the Indians were forced to flee. The Europeans shouted mocking taunts as they ran away. The men in the sand bunkers attempted to fire back, but they only had a few old bombards and their aim was wide off the mark. Eventually, they too had to run for their lives. The massive bombardment of the city then started in earnest. Cannonballs thundered overhead and smashed into the earthworks and thatched roofs of the houses near the shore. Decapitated palm trees splintered, groaned, and toppled, showering everything around with deadly shrapnel. Many men, women, and children were killed instantly, and thousands fled. Gama decided then and there that the shelling of the city would continue for the rest of the day." End quote. Despite all of this carnage and destruction, the admiral was not satisfied. The next day, the assault began again, but now instead of the homes that bordered the water, the larger homes and palaces set further inland were targeted. Again, one massive volley followed by another pummeled the city. Fires broke out and the people had to run for their lives. It was only darkness that brought an end to the destruction. Vasco, however, was in a bit of a predicament. He knew that he could not capture the city by landing troops. He'd be too greatly outnumbered. For now, he would have to settle for simply mastery of the sea. His hope was that the destruction that he ordered would bring the Samudri to terms. In that sense, he was right. The effect of this attack was being felt everywhere. Trade along the entire Malabar coast had ground to a halt. On November 3rd, the Armada departed to the south. Vicente Sodre and his squadron were ordered to patrol Calicut and blockade all shipping. Clearly, the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean now had the manpower to accomplish multiple objectives. To the south, Cochin was an excellent harbor built on a small peninsula of land that was surrounded by lagoons and waterways. Its Raja was a devoted ally of the Portuguese, though the trust and faith he placed in the Europeans was never fully returned in kind. For Vasco da Gama, this was a very productive stop. He immediately got to work filling his ships with spice. Delegates from Cannanore arrived advocating their support and an eagerness to continue trade. What's more, the queen of the neighboring city of Kolam sent in an envoy proposing the same thing. It was during this exchange with the embassy of Kolam that the Portuguese learned of a Christian community further to the south. It was said that the apostle St. Thomas had traveled to India and there had established a church. Now there were approximately 30,000 followers. Granted, they were a sect that followed the teachings of Nestorianism, making them all, well, heretics. But it was a start, and they were willing to pledge their loyalty to the King of Portugal. Vasco also learned of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, which was described as a rich island 300 leagues long with great mountains and an abundance of precious stones, pearls, and spice. This was quickly added to the map to be looked into later. Early 1503 saw things going definitively in the admiral's favor. His armada was fully loaded with spice, his patrolling squadrons were having a field day raiding the local shipping, and the cities of the Malabar coast were now competing for Portugal's favor, most advocating for the Portuguese to build a fortress in their area. Vasco da Gama knew that his bombardment of Calicut had a major effect. What's more, Vicente Sodre's blockade had reduced the city to near starvation, making it an example for anyone who would defy the Portuguese. Thus, it wasn't that surprising when the Samudri of Calicut sent in one of his esteemed Brahmin priests, heavily laden with gifts and jewels, as an envoy to renew talks. Skeptical at first, the admiral was eventually convinced to go back. He decided to take command of Estevão da Gama's ship, the Flor de la Mar, and with the addition of just one other small caravel, he sailed to Calicut to hear what its king would offer. After 3 days of traveling, Gama arrived at Calicut again. The Brahmin was sent into the city, but didn't return. Instead, another man arrived and asked if the admiral could send a man of high stature into the city to complete the negotiations. Vasco knew that something was off. His anger exploded, and this request was denied. The Zamoran sent back another message stating that as it was late, perhaps it would be best for all to get some rest and renew discussions in the morning. The admiral agreed, albeit he didn't really have much of a choice. The winds were calm, and there wasn't enough light to safely navigate out of the harbor. Fearing sabotage, Vasco ordered his men to secure his ship in place with a very strong metal line. Just before dawn on the next day, lookouts on the Flor de la Mar spotted a strange ship headed right towards them. It turned out to be 2 ships that were tied together. Vasco reasoned that this might be the Zamorans' delegation, but then more ships began to appear. There were small, agile fishing vessels, and all of them were moving at rapid speed toward them. The Portuguese men began to count them. First it was 20, then 40, then 80, and it became clear that there were soldiers on board. Suddenly, a nearby ship was set on fire by its crew. Its anchor line was cut, and the now fire barge was pushed in their direction. At the same time, the fast-moving fishing vessels had closed a considerable distance. They then revealed their hidden cargo. On board were small cannons. The early morning peace was shattered as the crews opened up. Cannonballs skimmed over the water and gouged holes in the hull of the Flor de la Mar. Vasco da Gama realized he was now outnumbered, outgunned, about to be engulfed in flame, and with the metal chain anchoring his ship, he was stuck in the water. His anger grew exponentially as it dawned on him that he had fallen right into the Zamorans' trap.